Hi, and welcome to this interview. My name is Noor. I'm the founder of Love Addicts. We're a community of people with anxious attachment. And today I'm very excited to have Dr. Gibson with me. Dr. Gibson is an expert on trauma and resilience, and I'm going to be asking her a lot about that today. So, welcome.
It's great to be here, Noor.
Awesome. Cool, cool, cool. So, yeah, it's going to be a really interesting interview because I think trauma is really related to attachment and it's really related to like relationships and insecurity. But a lot of talk these days goes about trauma, like, oh, I have trauma, or trauma, exists in my childhood or my friends or my parents, but we don't like really know what trauma is, I think. So could you maybe lead the interview, started out by explaining what trauma is and like what defines trauma?
Yeah, for sure. So it really depends if you're talking about it from a clinical perspective. So I started my career as a family doctor and I kind of became a trauma therapist when I realized that was the underlying cause of a lot of the problems I was seeing. So clinical definition of trauma is, you know, in the PTSD spectrum. So it would be something that is causing a change in your mind body system that is creating hypervigilance, so feeling really jumpy and always waiting for the shoe to drop. It's creating a negative worldview, so just feeling badly about yourself and the way that the world is affecting you.
Hmm.
It creates avoidance, where you're trying to not be in situations that are triggering or painful, and it creates um, intrusive thoughts where you're constantly thinking about things that have happened in the past or worried about things that could happen again in the future. So that's like the clinical definition of PTSD. And that's what a lot of folks in the medical field think of. But the simplest way to define trauma is trauma is actually a response in the body. Trauma
Hmm.
is a response to almost any situation. So in the DSM, where they define PTSD, it's really specific. It has to be something that's, a threat to your body, or witnessing uh, a threat to somebody that you care about. But really, trauma is anything that changes the mind body system to become more um, uh, fearful of danger. So it's a pattern that's set up in the amygdalas of your brain to start to be more sensitive to messages that it's getting, to be looking for danger. So as soon as you've encountered an experience that your amygdalas think, oh, that seems threatening, that sets up the trauma response in the mind body system.
Right. So it's whenever something triggers us to feel like to expect fear, essentially, in situation. Is it in situations that might like require us to be fearful, or is it just creating that situation where we feel fear in other situations that might actually be okay as well?
Well, and it's all comes down to perception, right? So everyone's brain is different. You could have two people in the same situation and they would have two different responses. One might set off that trauma cascade. So it's to do with the perception in the brain that something is threatening. And that perception is based on your own sensory experiences. So for some folks who are neurodivergent, they get a really amplified sensory experience of anything, both within their body and in their external environment. For other people, they might be a bit dissociated because of their painful past experiences, and they're not getting those amplified signals at all, and they're not sensing danger. So it really is dependent on the person. We can't say, like, this is a traumatic event for all people, because it depends on the individual. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle to understand, is they're like, well, that doesn't sound like it would have been traumatic to me. Well, maybe it wouldn't have been, but for that particular mind body system, it was.
Right. So it's not really just about the thing or experience itself. It's more about the person and how they perceived it as well, based on their mind and their body, and how that reacted to the event or the situation.
You've got it, Nora. That's exactly it. The differentiator is, it's not the thing that happened, it's your system's response to that thing. And
Right.
that's what a lot of people get confused about.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And that explains why some people might have trauma and some people might not, even though they've been in the same event or situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes sense. And so when it comes to that, like, do you think trauma is something that could happen at any point in someone's life, or does it happen in childhood? Because we also hear a lot about childhood trauma. So is it something that
Yeah.
could happen at any point?
Um, so a traumatic experience that's, perceived by the body as threatening is something that can actually happen during birth. I mean, you can have it at, you know, T minus one. You can have it when you're in the womb if the mother is having a traumatic experience. So for example, they took saliva samples of babies that were born to moms who were pregnant during the 9/11 World Trade Center disaster. And those babies had huge levels of stress hormone in their saliva. So you can inherit trauma even when before you're born. Birth can be traumatic. We can have pre-verbal trauma before the age of 3. And that basically means you have an implicit memory or a memory that you can't put into words, but that memory is telling you something is wrong about the world or that you're not good enough and you don't deserve to be safe. And you can't quite put your finger on why that is. So there's a lot of people who come and say, I feel like I'm driven by this like fight and flight and freeze reactions, and I can't put my finger on it. It seemed like that my childhood was pretty normal. I can't think of what it was. Sometimes it's pre-verbal. And then in childhood, a lot of people think of what happened to a child as being traumatic. But another thing that can take place during childhood is a lack of things that should be there. So childhood neglect, not feeling loved, not feeling cared for, not feeling safe. Those things can also be very traumatic to the developing brain. So there's this huge range of experiences that can be perceived as traumatic. Certainly events, natural disasters, man-made disasters, relationship issues that can be experienced as traumatic during one's entire lifespan.
Wow. Okay. And so would you say like one is able to identify the trauma that they've had in their life, or is it just an unrealistic expectation to try to work on all the trauma and figure out what we've been through in our lives? Because, as you said, some of it might not even be conscious, or even before we were conscious.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, so no, I think there are some forms of therapy where you're supposed to find every single event that happened and process that event. But the more modern versions of therapy, they look at what is your mind body system doing now as a result of that and
Mm,
work on what's happening in the moment.
mm,
So what are the things that are triggering? Work on those, processing those. What is the nervous system response? So, is your nervous system locked into flight? It's always restless. You're moving from place to place. There's this restless mind that's always overthinking. Well, what do we do with a nervous system that's locked in that response? What are the kinds of things we can do in the mind body? There's a lot of somatic interventions, so body based therapies that work amazing for a nervous system that's locked in that response. So, you don't have to go through the details. In fact, from what I've researched, it can actually be really problematic to go through the details of all the past traumas because you're basically strengthening the memory pathway towards those events. So we generally don't encourage that in more modern trauma therapies.
wow. So it's actually could be counterproductive to try to work on
Yeah.
every little like, or try to figure out every little trauma that you've had in your life and try to work on that. And it's actually much better to focus on what's happening in the moment and work from there.
It depends on the person. So for some people, they really have to go through the events and process the emotions and sensations that come up because traumatic memories aren't stored in the same way that normal memories are. We call this explicit and implicit memory.
Mm,
So explicit memory would be like, hey, Nor, what'd you have for dinner last night? And you'd be like, oh, well, I had some pasta and tomato
mm,
sauce.
mm,
And that wouldn't bring up any emotion when you told me the story about what you had for dinner. But if I said to you, hey, could you tell me about that car accident yesterday? As soon as I say that, your body feels tense and you get some, nausea coming up from the gut and you start to feel a little bit scared and oh, you're even sweating, even thinking about it. So that traumatic memory is stored with the associations. And that's another part of what your amygdala does. So your amygdala is like the fire detector. It's constantly looking for threats in your inside environment, so inside the body, and anything that you're encountering in the external world. The other thing that the amygdala does is it stores the associations to painful traumatic memories in the past. So it doesn't store those memories like a story. The amygdala actually stores associations. It
Mm.
stores the emotions and physical sensation and triggers or context of what was happening in that moment. So for some people, they actually have to dissociate what's stored in the amygdala, which means disconnect it from the memory. And so there's lots of different therapeutic tools. We use things like EMDR. Some people use prolonged exposure. I find it to be, sometimes kind of hard to go through for a patient. I use a method called accelerated resolution therapy, where we would detach those associations stored in the amygdala. And then you would be able to tell me the story of that traumatic event while feeling neutral in your body.
Oh, wow.
And those associations wouldn't come back again. So you're basically restoring the memory as a normal memory.
Mm.
And there's lots of different pathways towards that. There's brain spotting. There's all kinds of new therapies coming up that allow you to transform your memories in that way. And some people do need that kind of therapy. So for some folks, they just work on, well, what is the nervous system response to those painful experiences in the present moment? And some people have a lot of storage in that amygdala, and we actually have to detach those associations. So it depends on the person. But there's pathways. So a lot of people feel like trauma isn't something that can be helped. And frankly, most therapists aren't trauma, or not most, but many therapists are not trauma informed, and they don't have a toolkit of therapeutic modalities that actually work on trauma. So it could just be that you haven't been seeing the right person, if you're not getting there.
Right. And so at what point would it be smart for a person to seek out a trauma therapist or someone with experience with trauma like that?
Well, I mentioned the symptoms of PTSD, like that feeling that something bad's going to happen, those intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, avoiding places, negative worldviews, negative views about yourself. Anything like that, I really think therapy is the way to go. I don't think you can self-help your way out of that. I mean, I wrote a book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, and my intention was to give people the foundations of what is trauma, how is it showing up in your mind body, and to give them lots of tools to help reset the nervous system. But you can't process trauma on your own. That's not something that you can do safely. So if there's something that seems to be stuck in those amygdalas, if you're stuck in one of those PTSD symptoms, it's definitely best to find a professional to help.
Yeah, it's always good to keep an eye on like what you feel and have that awareness. And if you have those symptoms,
Yeah.
then try to find someone to help, because we can't do everything on our own as well.
Well, and it depends too, like how you're getting by. If it's affecting your relationships, if it's affecting your ability to work, to sleep, to enjoy yourself, to actually enjoy your life, then that's another really good signal that it's time to find someone to help.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I got actually a couple more questions on trauma, and maybe we can then talk about trauma in the context of relationships as well, because that's really interesting, especially with
Yeah,
attachment. But
absolutely.
what I was also wondering is, can trauma be inherited? Like, say, can, for example, our mother's trauma or our father's trauma affect us? And can we like be holding on to that trauma? Because I've also heard of intergenerational trauma, and I've heard some talk on that as well. But I'm curious what you would think of it and what the most recent research says about that.
Yeah, there's two pathways towards inheriting trauma. The first one is, just the way that the parenting style is happening. So we've talked a little bit about attachment, but you can inherit trauma through abuse or neglect, or um, relational dynamics from your caregivers that is causing a trauma response in your system. So one way that we inherit trauma is through parenting, or caregiving, or a lack thereof. And another way that we inherit it is actually through our genetic code. So the more that we're learning about trauma responses, we call it epigenetics. So when I was an undergrad, Prior to medical school, I actually studied genetics. And what we now understand about the genome and how that's passed down was not something that we understood 30 years ago. Things have really changed in genetics. What epigenetics tells us is that traumatic events can actually alter your genetic code. So we used to think that the nucleus with the DNA was the brain of your cell. And what we're now coming to understand is that the cell wall, what is interacting with your environment and the chemical soup that your cells are sitting in, is actually changing your DNA code. So we always thought the DNA code was fixed, but we're finding that there's methylation. So that's something that happens to the amino acids that make up our DNA. And once that's happened, it can be inherited. So our genetic code can change as a result of trauma. So they've done lots of studies on animal models. So one that always comes to mind because it's just so surprising is there was a group of mice that were exposed to a chemical smell. I think it was cherry blossoms, but a very neutral smell. But that smell was paired with something that was traumatic to the mice, so like a painful stimulus. And so those mice inherited pairing that smell with something that was uncomfortable. For 3 generations. When they were testing the kids, the grandkids, the great grandkids of those mice that were in that original research study, 3 generations of mice inherited an aversion or trying to avoid that smell because they believed that smell was dangerous. So the original mouse that paired that event changed their genetic code so that the future generations of mice would also inherit that danger signal. I mean, that's so powerful because there's really no other way that that could happen. So in human models, we can see they've studied folks who survived the Holocaust in Germany. And what they noticed was that their offspring would inherit some traumatic responses that didn't make sense based on their lived experience. So we do know in both human and animal models that epigenetics is very real. It happens. We're starting to get an understanding of what happens at that biological level. But from what we know, trauma is definitely inherited. We see it in Canada a lot with our First Nations communities. Even if they weren't brought up inside the home, they still have trauma that's stored in their body. They still have a predilection to trauma responses that aren't explained by what happens in their lives.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's not to say that things can't be done for that. So even if you don't hold the memory of the traumatic event, there's still lots that can be done. So one huge resource is a book called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin. And it goes through all these amazing exercises you can do to tap into the trauma of your ancestors. You can work on the present symptoms of those past traumas that you don't have the words for. Psychedelic journeys can be really powerful in working on ancestral trauma. So it's not to say that we don't have tools for that. It's just, it's harder for us to have words to describe how it is that we feel when the original trauma wasn't even something we consciously know about.
Right. It's a little bit more complicated than when you've actually experienced it.
Exactly. Yeah.
It is really fascinating. And it also makes me think of like when we talk about intergenerational trauma and even trauma within someone's own life, I always think of these things as well. Like I have this tendency to see it from an evolutionary perspective. Like there must be a
Mm.
reason why we feel this. Like, do you think trauma can ever be a good thing, a positive thing? Like, can it actually be there to protect us? Or is it always something that we need to figure out and work on?
So that's such an interesting question, Nor, because traumatic responses in the mind body are always there to protect us. So
Mm.
the reason why our amygdala stores that information is because it wants to protect you from future threats. So it stores all the information around the original threat saying, okay, well, I know what to look out for. I'm going to protect this organism from something like similar in the future. And that's why it stores all the associations. So everything around the fight, flight, and freeze systems are designed to protect us. And we know this from animal biology because humans are just really complicated mammals. But when we look at other beings in the mammal kingdom, they have those same responses that we do. So the human responses don't always make sense in modernity and with our complex, complicated relationships. But if you think about how an animal tries to escape danger, if there's a fire, it tries to outrun the fire. If there is a predator, it runs away or tries to fight it. The freeze response is basically it just playing possum. It lays down and pretends it's dead, or it tries to just be really small and quiet until the predator goes away. So, from a mammal perspective, these human responses that we see to trauma, they make perfect sense. These were protective mechanisms. But in the human body, because of our complex lives, fighting something, running away from something, playing dead, or just not getting out of bed, those are not always adaptive. So even though these survival strategies were designed in our organism to protect us, they are not always helping us get towards our goals, whether that's relationships or kind of life success and objectives, because they're more primitive responses. So part of the work is to figure out, well, am I stuck in fight, flight, and freeze? And then learning how your own nervous system is trying to protect you, and not shaming about it and saying, oh gosh, there's something wrong with me. What I love about the more modern day therapies, the one I love in particular is called NARM, or the neuroaffective relational model, is it's constantly saying, well, why does that make sense? Why would it make sense that your body's responding in that way? And it's such a self-compassionate response, because it's letting you know, like, hey, your body was just trying to protect you this whole time. And rather than saying, in a more CBT perspective, which is the gold standard therapy for trauma, it has a more different approach. It's like, well, your thinking patterns are wrong and it's causing wrong behaviors and actions. In my mind, I think your thinking patterns are right. And let's figure out why they showed up in that way, why they still feel you need these survival strategies. So different therapists will have different takes on it, but that's mine.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's much more self-compassionate as well to understand, like, because whenever you feel something or whenever something exists, it must be something that's natural and there must be a reason behind it. And so trying to say it's wrong is not always the right way, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can end up having a lot of shame that mounts up over your own responses if you don't understand why they're there. So believing that there's something right about those responses helps quell the shame, because a lot of trauma shows up as shame in terms of emotional experience. And so we want to lessen that. We don't want to add to that.
Indeed. Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Lessen the shame and make it more normal so that we feel that there's something we
Yeah.
can actually also work with.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. So relationships. Are you ready for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go.
So the other side of psychology, attachment, right? Like we got the trauma and then we have the like attachment, and a lot of people talking about attachment theory and insecure attachment, and I feel they're really, really closely related. But do you think that trauma is the cause of insecure attachment, for example, anxious attachment? And if so, like what is the mechanism? Like what happens so that someone can be anxiously attached in their life?
Yeah. So I, we would typically call this a developmental trauma. So something that happens to a young child that creates a foundational belief about relationships that happen between them and caregivers. So oftentimes an anxious attachment can result from a caregiver that is just really inconsistent. So when they don't know what to expect, then they're constantly striving for that bond, and their their caregiver might be, dismissive and just not getting their needs met. So you can imagine a child that is feeling um like they want to have a loving relationship with their caregiver, and they're just not getting what they're wanting, that would set up some foundational beliefs as they enter into adulthood. If we look at it from a trauma perspective, the like I don't use the foundation of attachment theory in my practice. What I really love is the NARM model. And so what it's asking is, um which part of you is desiring connection and which part of you is fearing connection? And what are those obstacles? Like whether or not it was an event or just a feeling in the body, but like, what is the thing that's creating this avoidance of connection or this fear of connection? The same with attunement, like being in touch with your own system and feeling authentic and getting your own needs met, and even asking for what you need. Because if a kid's not getting their needs met, they're not even going to feel comfortable, trying to get their needs met. So a lot of anxious attachment is like this kind of clinginess and saying, please, please help me, something's wrong. And as an adult, that is interpreted as, anxiety within the relationship. But if you think about developmentally, how that would show up is if you're not getting your needs met, trying and trying and trying to get your needs met by asking for it, by, you know, um, constantly worrying that it's not going to happen. Like, well, what's going to happen next? And of course, you're going to let me down. Everyone lets me down. I have this foundational belief because this is what happened to me as a kid. So we set up those patterns. And from a NARM perspective, what we would do is try to find the child consciousness that's stuck in that belief system. So which part of you, which parts language is internal family systems, Gestalt theory, but there's this part that's inside you that's really stuck at that stage where you didn't get the connection that you needed, or you didn't get the attunement that you needed. You didn't get the love and intimacy that you needed from your caregivers. And because this part of you is stuck at that developmental stage, this keeps showing up in patterns in your adult relationships. And so how do we figure out what is the perception of the obstacles? Like what's kind of getting in your way? Is it a feeling that you have about yourself or about the world? Do you have any evidence to the contrary? And then try to evoke agency. Well, what do you have control over? What are the parts that you can self-soothe? What are the parts where you can recognize, oh, wait a minute, this person never let me down. This person was someone really consistent for me. And yeah, I can reframe my belief system based on this relationship. So what we're trying to do is basically reparent, is to try to create more experiences. And you can reparent yourself. You can do it in group work. Like um, there's a psychodrama that I learned from Bessel van der Kolk that was so powerful, where you can do group healing and you reparent yourself in a group situation. And you can do it through therapy. I mean, the goal of a therapist is to give you unconditional positive regard and to start healing that relational wound. So a large part of our job is to offer that connection, to offer that attunement.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So essentially, you're kind of rewriting the childhood story that you might have stored in yourself by doing it to
Yeah.
yourself, potentially through relationships as well, relationships that could be the opposite of what you've had or something that is quite like consistent and secure. And that would teach you new beliefs. And then you would kind of rewrite that story and you would
Yeah.
feel secure. So what I think of sometimes as well is sometimes like you mentioned patterns, right? And so when someone has the belief of um, love is inconsistent, I have to ask for it, I have to constantly worry about it, I don't know if it's going to be there. And then they go into relationships, and sometimes the patterns repeat themselves, and they end up in relationships where that is the case as well, and the partner is
Yeah.
not really consistent. And so I think if repeated trauma like happening, so sometimes the original trauma, which is the childhood um, inconsistency, for example, happens again in adulthood, and now you have a relationship that has caused you the same feeling, but now you're conscious of it, and actually like you're thinking of this person all the time, and you're kind of getting like really anxious and worrying about them, and maybe they broke up with you or the relationship didn't work, and it's not even worse. So there's an even like, so now you've got reinforced in a negative way. And what could you do when that happens?
Yeah. Um, we see that often. I mean, there's lots of words in the psychotherapy field around trauma bonds and codependency and the way that you reenact those childhood patterns as adults. These things do happen quite often in people who haven't explored their own kind of foundational beliefs and what's true and what's um, perhaps the story that they're telling themselves about the world and their place in the world. So I mean, I hate to say that therapy is the solution to everything, but I do think you can read a lot that helps you understand your own, mind body system. There's so many books out there that can help you um shine some light into those shadow corners, because a lot of these patterns that we fall into in these survival strategies, relational and physical, um, they're not in conscious awareness. And so the more that we become more alerted to them and attuned with them and compassionate towards them, the more that we can shift those patterns. So I mentioned it briefly, but from an internal family systems perspective, you would say, well, what's this child inside you that is recreating this relationship, looking for this one thing? What is this child inside you that's trying so hard to be perfect so that it deserves love? And how could we soothe this child in another way, letting it know you never had to be perfect? You always deserved love. And a therapist can help with that, but from an internal family systems perspective, we all have that capacity within us. There's an adult consciousness called the integrated self that can help these younger parts of us to achieve that. I mean, it's integration, but it's just what they're looking for. Like these parts of us that got stuck not getting their needs met, they're still trying and trying to get those needs met. And because they're um younger consciousness, they can get stuck in those patterns. So within all of us is the capacity to understand what those patterns are and to take a more observing stance to it. So there's three different stages to trauma healing according to Judith Herman. This was back decades ago. And the first stage is just noticing, like, what can you observe? So what are you noticing about your relationships? What are you noticing about how you show up? What are you noticing about what your own needs are? And what happens within those dynamics. So that observing stance and trying to not always feel like you're in the moment, but sometimes feeling like you're watching that moment. Well, how interesting. I can see she's doing this, or how interesting how he responded. And even thinking about yourself in third person, because part of it is those child consciousness frameworks acting up in the relationship. So looking at it from a third person perspective makes sense because it's not necessarily your adult self showing up. The second stage is processing. So why does it make sense that this is the belief system? Why does it make sense that you're behaving in those ways? And just trying to figure out why that dynamic makes sense for you. Oh yeah, it makes sense that I'm really perfectionistic because that was the only way I could get love from my caregivers is if I was really, really good at everything. And so of course I'm showing up in this way in relationships and trying to people please constantly and fawning and just doing all of these behaviors because that's what I equate as getting me love. Yeah, I can see how that makes sense. So the process work is trying to find the origin of those patterns and the stuck associations and the stuck foundational beliefs and work through those. And there's body-based practices that can help because sometimes trauma is stuck in the body, and there's lots of brain-based or cognitive therapies that can work as well. I love internal family systems and the NARM model. Those are kind of my two favorites, but there's lots of different versions out there. And there's lots you can do that aren't verbal. So if you feel like it's really hard for you to work through and talk through it, because some people just can't get there, things like accelerated resolution therapy, brain spotting, tapping is a combination using self acupressure. Havening is creating calm brain waves and changing the associations through neuroplasticity. There are so many new therapies out there that it doesn't have to be one size fits all. There's going to be a way, a pathway for every mind body system to heal.
Yeah, I think that's really reassuring to hear as well. Like knowing that there are tools out there, there's new stuff that actually like could work for different people. And even
Yeah.
if you've been through like maybe an inconsistent or insecure attachment in your childhood or in your relationships as well, maybe a tough relationship, there is still a way for you to work on this in different ways actually that could fit you, or doesn't have to be like one therapy as well, which is, yeah, I think is really reassuring to hear.
Yeah. I think there's always trending therapies, right? So right now, for example, internal family systems is one that everyone's talking about. It's very popular to be learning it. And it's hard to get into the courses to actually do the study. So it's in high demand.
Yeah.
Um, so but when I was in medical school a few decades ago, cognitive behavior therapy was all that we talked about, and lots of free therapies that are available in the public system in different countries. That is the one that's offered. So can you get somewhere using CBT? Yeah, many people can. It's not my favorite modality. I think there's lots of newer ones that are more efficacious and more compassionate, but lots of people get very far with CBT. And CPT, cognitive processing therapy, which is like a manualized trauma version of that. So, just trying to explore what you think will be a good fit for you, I think is really important. And so what I tried to do in my book was to help people understand what are some of the somatic and cognitive therapies that are out there. So it's not like you have to go pay $200 per session and, try them all out, because that can be pretty time and energy and money intensive.
Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of try them out yourself first and then you see what works for you.
Exactly. Yeah. And for some people, the somatic or the body-based doorway is the easiest one. If they don't have the capacity to put the trauma in words, if they don't have the um, awareness of what emotions are showing up, if they can't tell the story of their trauma, then cognitive therapies might not be the best doorway in. And the other reason I really believe that to be true for lots of people is because when your amygdalas are firing constantly and you're stuck in those trauma responses and you're feeling that the world is not safe, your thinking brain actually turns off. Like when the body is stuck in a fight, flight, or freeze response, it does not send a lot of energy to your thinking brain because it just thinks the organism is in danger and it has to get out right away. And so um, Dan Siegel, he's like a psychiatrist in the States who's written some brilliant books around trauma and the way that the developing brain happens, especially in teenagers. And he has this thing called a hand model, where he makes a fist with your hand with the thumb in the middle of the fist. And the midbrain is the seat of your emotions, what we used to call the limbic system, but we now know is not a pure system. But it's where a lot of those emotional memories are stored in the brain. And when that system becomes overactive, it kicks off the fingers of the fist. So what he says is we flip our lid. And basically what it means is the cognitive brain, or the neocortex that does a lot of the complex thinking, it just goes offline. So when I'm working with folks with trauma, they will constantly say to me, I feel like I'm in a brain fog. My memory is terrible. I can't concentrate on anything. Like I work at the refugee clinic, and they're constantly saying, I can't pay attention to my English classes because these traumatic reactions are just preventing it. Like I have a brain fog. I can't concentrate. Like, please doctor, help me. And I'll say, well, the help isn't like, there's nothing that I need to do inside your brain. Like a vitamin isn't going to fix this. That this is something that we need to heal from the inside with the trauma responses. And so with a lot of folks whose thinking brain is not online, I would say the body and the somatic therapies is the best doorway in. And that's definitely what I focus on in my book, is because there are so many ways that the human body naturally heals and naturally restores its nervous system. But in modern times, we've consciously repressed those, or we've like been socially conditioned to just not do them. So the body can tremor the way a dog does and let go of its daily tension. The body can do really, really gentle movements and just self-soothing touch and create calmer brainwaves. The body has so many natural mechanisms for healing that trauma response. And we just we don't teach it in school. We don't teach it to parents and teachers. It's just not a part of our daily routine, and it should be.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. But I feel like a lot of people are kind of starting to go back into that as well.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually want to ask you about resilience as well, because I feel that's kind of the pathway as well to prevent maybe future negative effects of trauma. But I have one more
Yeah.
question about relationships. Maybe I'd love to hear your perspective as a trauma expert. Like, what do you define, or how do you define trauma bonds? Because that seems like quite a popular, word or keyword these days.
Yeah. Um, so I would describe trauma bonds as the kind where your particular caregiving pattern becomes reenacted.
Mm.
So for some people in a trauma bond, they're looking for power and control. And a lot of times it's because they didn't have that. So I see a lot of vilification of personality disorders, and I'm not a huge ascriber to that diagnosis anymore. Um, Now that I understand more about trauma. So people will say, like, oh, they're showing up, they're a narcissist, and they're behaving in these ways to exert power and control. And the way that I would think about it as a trauma therapist is to think, well, why is that an unmet need? Why does it make sense that they need so much coercive control over this relationship? And why would that make sense that they didn't get a need met around control when they were younger, or they learned that control was equated to love? So, why does it make sense that a person is showing up in that way? Likewise, when a person is being dominated in a relationship and that's their part of a trauma bond, I would say, well, why does it make sense that you just are constantly trying to please somebody and you're so desperate for love that you're willing to accept something that's not getting your needs met or is even abusive? Why does it make sense that you are so striving for love and intimacy that you're willing to consciously or unconsciously allow this pattern to be established? Why would it make sense based on those past patterns? So to me, a trauma bond is something that makes sense. It's something that makes sense based on the past experiences of the people in relationship. And the question that I ask is, why does it make sense for you? So that would be my take on it. That might be a bit different than what you've heard before.
Got it. It does make a lot of sense though. And especially the part where you kind of see it from a compassionate view as well. Like it's not really that you're vilifying the person, but more so like, well, what really happened? What is the reason behind this, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I think we're really quick to vilify folks
Yeah.
in relationships. And I mean, like just even the word toxic person, toxic relationship gets thrown out a lot these days. And I'm not saying that they aren't harmful, but I am saying that they usually make sense.
Mhm.
And looking at self compassion for all people involved, and where was each of them wounded, and how was each of them wounded in a way that their survival strategies are enacting in these ways. I think it's just a question that's more hopeful, and it's a question that's more healing, because we're not just dismissing and saying, well, this person's toxic, they can never be in a safe relationship. I don't know that that's true. It's possible, especially if people aren't looking for that insight and trying to lean into adult consciousness and do their healing. Then yeah, they might enact that pattern in all future relationships. But do I also believe that, healing from these traumatic patterns is possible for all people?
Yeah.
Yeah, for most of us, it is.
Yeah. And that makes me wonder, like sometimes if, say, we're dating someone or we're in a relationship or anything with, with a person who might be dealing with old trauma, and so they might be on, say, the anxious spectrum or the avoidance spectrum. And at some point, like we try to be compassionate and we try to be really, loving and try to see the reason as to why this is happening. But at some point, this might start to affect us negatively as well.
Yeah.
As a therapist, where would you say the line is? At what point would you say, okay, well, this relationship is not healthy for me, even though I love this person and I would love for them to heal and I have a lot of compassion and empathy for them, but this is affecting me negatively and I need to protect myself and get out of it.
Yeah. I would say that there is no line that's a universal line. Well, that's not true. I would say abuse is something that should be left. So if it's emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, that's not a sustainable relationship. And that person who's perpetrating the abuse needs to do their own healing before they're safe in a relationship. So that I think would be a line that I would draw. But I mean, there's so many there. Emotional abuse is a spectrum, right? There could be name calling, there could be passive aggressive tendencies, there could be emotional neglect. What is it that you can tolerate and still feel mentally well? That answer is different for every human. And so I don't know a lot of therapists who would say strongly, like, it's time for you to get out of this relationship. It really has to be that person who's feeling like it's time for them. And sometimes that time takes longer. I mean, um, I can speak to my personal experience with it, where I've had therapists say to me, I don't know if this relationship is going to work out. And I have stayed in it much longer than a rational person with my background should, because there's just something in there that's holding me in it. Um, I can't really put into words why that kind of thing happens, but it does.
Yeah.
And you're ready when you're ready, you know? I think we become more ready when we are able to tap into our adult consciousness, because when our child consciousness is meeting their child consciousness, that trauma bond can be so strong because these children are interacting like that, like, you know, these younger parts of us in internal family system, we call that the exiles. They just don't always think like an adult. And so they can get us really stuck in those relationships. So if your child consciousness is saying, oh, just try a little harder and maybe they'll love you, and your adult consciousness is saying, no, this is never going to work, until the adult consciousness is driving the train, you're not going to be able to get out. So part of it is learning, well, like, which aspects of me are in this relationship? Is it my wounded parts that are in the relationship, or is my, you know, integrated self that is understanding this relationship with clarity and with compassion for both, and with just like a comprehensive understanding of the past experiences on both sides. And I think the more that the person is able to show up in that adult consciousness, the closer they are to recognizing when they have to get out,
Right.
if they do.
Right. So it's a lot about stepping out of your child consciousness into adult consciousness. And I feel
Yeah.
a big part of that, to flow into resistance as well, resilience is developing resilience in yourself and being able to maybe stand in the face of trauma. And maybe that would be helpful for you to be able to get into adult consciousness when you need to as well. So, you are a resilience expert as well. And I was wondering, like, what's your perspective on that? How do you define resilience? How does it relate to that as well?
Yeah. So it's funny. I would certainly um, have some awareness of resilience, but I don't actually always say that people should strive for resilience, because if you look at the definitions of resilience, resilience can be getting back to your baseline. So you encounter a trauma and you get back to baseline. Resilience is oftentimes forced on individuals and communities that are historically marginalized and oppressed. And that can include a person who's been through trauma, or a community that's been through trauma. So a racialized community, the refugees that I work with. So resilience can sometimes be forced on somebody, and then it becomes toxic in itself, is because I would love some peace where I don't have to be forced to be constantly resilient and keep bouncing back from these traumas. So what I envision is that rather than being forced to be resilient and bouncing back, is a time where you are encountering less trauma. I just wish more peace for people. And then if you do encounter trauma, what I help people strive for is post-traumatic growth. And that's what I see as that third phase of trauma recovery, is how can you learn? How can you grow? How can you spend more time in adult consciousness? How can you level up? So to me, a lot of the evolution of the human ecosystem is people who've been through traumatic events, and they just have a greater awareness of their own nervous systems, of their own place in relationships, and their own relationship with these greater ecosystems. Like, we're encountering these huge collective traumas recently with pandemic and with a climate emergency. And the more of us that are showing up in adult consciousness and not showing up in our trauma responses, the better we can manage and mitigate the things that are happening in these greater systems. So I think of trauma is happening in lots of different systems at different levels. And I think of post-traumatic growth as the goal rather than resilience. So there's an illustration in my book that I think is just really telling. And there's a colored version of it in the QR code. And it's a person who's just kind of floating along in life, and they're floating and everything's fine and no big deal. And they encounter a traumatic experience and they're pulled underwater, and they feel like they can't catch their breath, and it's a struggle, and it's just hard to see clearly because you're underwater. Resilience would be you're floating again. So whether somebody's thrown you a flotation device, whether or not you've managed to change your body position, or you've found a way to float and you can just keep your head above water for a little while, that's resilience, as you're back to your baseline. Post-traumatic growth would be, what does it look like to swim? And with a podcast like you're doing, with helping people understand their own responses, with helping people to understand their minds and their mind-body connection, to understand their relationships and their place in the world, this is the path towards post-traumatic growth. This is what teaches you how to swim. And for everybody, swimming looks different. For some, it's like the backstroke. For others, they're just dog paddling. But the more that we gain these tools to learn how to swim, the better we can show up in relationships, the better we can show up for ourselves. And that's what I hope for everybody. So while I have awareness of resilience, my goal for folks is post-traumatic growth.
Right. That's what we should really strive for, is being able to
Exactly.
level up, not just like float, but also be able to swim and be able to actually, like, step into our adult consciousness and have the tools to to deal with it when we need to.
You got it. Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and it's really it's a nice way to look at it, rather than what maybe a lot of previous research or people talk about, which is we need to build resilience, and we need to, like, be able to face and always float back to the top, but rather be able to swim and have the tools to do that is much more important.
Well, if you really think about extending that metaphor, if you're just floating along, it's really easy to get pulled under again. Whereas if you've learned how to swim, it's not as easy to get pulled under. And so that's one of the things that I think can be useful for folks, is to learn these tools, like both the body-based tools, the mind-based tools. That means that you're not going to get pulled under as often as you were.
Yeah.
So like constantly getting pulled under is exhausting,
Mm.
mentally, psychologically, physically exhausting, spiritually exhausting. And one of the beautiful aspects of working on your trauma and working on those responses is it's not as tiring to go through life.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And it also makes me think of one thing when it comes to, like, the metaphor as well, like knowing how to swim. It sounds like it's also kind of something you do on your own. And when I think of trauma as well, and also like learning how to swim, to extend the metaphor again, I also think of community. I feel like sometimes that's important. Do you feel like
Mm,
this is something that is like also an important part of the post-traumatic growth and the healing? And especially today, where I feel like we're stepping into some kind of loneliness pandemic, and a lot of people are kind of working through all of this on their own. What do you think
yeah.
the role of community would be, and what can we do about it?
So you just found a really good hole in the metaphor, because you're totally right, Nor. Relational trauma heals in relationships.
Hmm.
So whether that's in relationships with friends, with partners, with your therapist, with parents, and changing the relationship with them, it is a relational uh it is a relational process. And it's not to say that you can't develop the relationship with self as that relational process. Like, you having a different relationship with your child parts can be a relational healing to that. But a lot of times it means that it has to be those outside relationships too. And so, yeah, I mean, as soon as you said that, what came to mind is I live in Western Canada. And if I was visiting the coast north of Vancouver Island last summer with my sister and her family, and the the kids, we took them to see a bear and a whale watching tour. And we saw these otters that were rafting together. And it's these little sea otters. They're just like honestly the cutest things I've ever seen. And they would link their elbows and they had formed a raft of, I kid you not, 80 otters. I mean, that's not an exact count, but when the guide was like trying to approximate how many otters were in this little raft, it was a huge amount of otters. It was bigger than the boat. And I was thinking, what a resilient system this group of otters is. Like they are just looking out for each other, and probably half of them are asleep and just coasting along. And then the other ones, they've got their back. They're swimming for them. So yeah, I love that metaphor, and I really do believe this. So community is the answer to most problems. There's a ton of literature and research about that. We are in a loneliness pandemic. I mean, another place where I work is the addiction clinic, and there's a whole book about the opposite of addiction being connection. And I think connection doesn't have to be, I'm in a relationship, I'm in a partnered love relationship. Connection can be with self, connection can be with pets, connection can be with nature, but connecting, I think, is really, really key to healing.
Yeah. And so we should make that a priority. Connect,
Absolutely.
community,
Yeah.
being around people, and also, as you mentioned, other types of connections. But I think people are, they're really important to us.
Well,
And
we are social beings, and there are some people whose trauma is so significant that they have a great fear of connection to other humans. And, ideally, healing on the other side will allow that reconnection to be explored, but it can be a journey for some folks. And so what they would do is just explore other ways of connecting until that feels safe. But yeah, I mean, humans are social beings. We are meant to live in villages and look after each other. In modern day neo-colonial capitalistic societies, we're told like individual desires trump and look after your own. But that's really not how humans were designed. We were designed to be collective.
yeah.
And like collectivist societies, I think actually hold a lot of the answers to the bigger problems that we face.
And so we should look into that as well. Like,
Absolutely.
we go back to our roots, and it's
Yeah.
a process. Yeah.
And that part, that sentence you said was so prescient, because as much as we inherit ancestral trauma, we also inherit ancestral resilience. And so to look back at our roots, what was working? What was working for us ancestrally? For a lot of us, it was community.
Indeed. Yeah. And it's what really set humans apart as well, if we want to go into, how humans even came to be to this civilizational power and everything. It's really community, and it's really our ability to work together.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a beautiful way to end it. We're almost out of time as well. And so I was wondering if you had any final thoughts on trauma, on healing, on post-traumatic growth.
No, I mean, you asked such fantastic questions. So I can't think of anything that needs to be said. I might just mention where to find me. So my book is The Modern Trauma Toolkit. It's available in Europe, States, Canada. Moderntrauma.com has buying options for those places. And I'm also on TikTok. That's kind of my main social media right now, which is TikTok Trauma Doc. And I will be putting more into my YouTube channel just because I worry that TikTok might disappear, which makes me really sad because I've learned so much about trauma and relational trauma on TikTok. It's a wealth of information. So that's just how to find me and my work.
Cool. So TikTok, and stay in tune for YouTube, and definitely check out the website as well and your book.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Gibson. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that we get to catch up soon again.
Oh my gosh, Christy is fine. Even my patients don't call me Dr. Gibson. Thank
All
you
right,
so
Christine.
much, Nor. Okay.
All right, Christine. It was a pleasure. Bye.